Ghosts, Spirits, and Hauntings with Loyd Auerbach today on the Universal Learning Series radio show. I'm your host, Sandy Andrew. Welcome. Since the mid-1990s, the spread of interest in ghost hunting has been exponential in great part because of the increased number of paranormal television shows, the internet, and the availability of affordable handheld environmental sensors. In the anthology, Ghosts, Spirits, and Hauntings, parapsychologist Loyd Auerbach presents a general introduction to parapsychology and its study of psychic phenomena, which includes ghosts, hauntings, and poltergeists. Loyd shows why such phenomena are, by definition, psychic, and why other psychic phenomena such as ESP and PsychoKinesis, mind over matter, are essential to an understanding of ghostly happenings. Loyd Auerbach is an adjunct professor at JFK University and teaches parapsychology at HCH Institute, both in Northern California. Please visit his website at mindreader.com. Welcome, Loyd. Thanks for joining us today on the Universal Learning Series radio show.
Thanks very much, Sandy.
Let me start off with this question for you, Loyd. What is the field of parapsychology?
Well, parapsychology studies essentially phenomena of consciousness of the mind and how the mind directly interacts with people and the world around us. So we look at how the mind picks up information without the use of the normal senses, or what we call the normal senses or perceptions. We call that ESP. We look at how the mind directly affects matter and energy just through intention, essentially, and we call that psychokinesis, or mind over matter. Mind-matter interaction is a new phrase we're using. And we look at the idea that consciousness or mind can survive the death of the body, which would bring us to ghosts and reincarnation and other similar concepts of survival of bodily death. Part of the definition of parapsychology is to study all of this, and it is by nature outside the normal explanatory process of science right now, although the scientific method is what we actually use. So our knowledge base in science doesn't give us a lot, just like it doesn't give us a lot about consciousness itself. But we're trying to figure out how this all fits in and how people's experiences are really talking about the human condition and what we really are.
Loyd, how long have you been studying in this field, studying and working?
Well, studying probably since the late 60s when I was a kid. I actually started a parapsychology club in around 1972 in high school. So I've been really into this for a very, very long time. But I've been working in the field since 1982 after getting a master's degree in parapsychology from JFK University. Before that, my first job actually was for the American Society for Psychical Research in New York.
Oh, okay. Well, the book Ghosts, Spirits, and Hauntings, and the subtitle is Am I Being Haunted? Mm-hmm. Let's ask the question, what's a ghost?
Well, the word ghost has a slightly different meaning from culture to culture, but generally in Western folklore and Western culture, a ghost is the spirit or consciousness, the soul, whatever you want to call it, of a human being or an animal after the death of that biological being. So it's the spirit hanging around after death. And the word ghost can be applied to other things that don't have any spirit connection. For example, people often talk about ghosts or related to hauntings, which in parapsychology would be what people often call residual hauntings, the idea that a location or an object just holds a little information about its past. And by holding that object or being in that object, you actually can get a vision which looks very real sometimes of people who were around that object or in that house. But it's more of a recording than it is of an actual conscious being. And we tend to try to use ghosts now for more of the conscious than the unconscious in the recordings.
Interesting. Now, there's a lot of television shows and other things going on, and it kind of spoke some fear into you, and they show you the highlights and people running around screaming. Mm-hmm. How real is that?
Well, it's real apparently for the ghost hunting groups that have modeled themselves after those shows, but it's not real from a scientific or parapsychological approach. First thing that's so not real is we don't sit around in the dark. The reality is that you really couldn't do that unless you just wanted to be just in the dark until night vision cameras came about in the early 90s, commercially available. And that's really an invention of television. It's to make things look much more spooky, but because it's been part and parcel of these shows, it's really become the way the amateur ghost hunters actually go about their hobby, because it's not really a study what they're doing. So the shows also don't focus too much about the people's experience. They often ask the people to leave the home. They often ignore the people's experiences in favor of their technology, and that's just not the way that we do research. The tech was brought in to look for environmental considerations that might affect or be part of the experience, may even cause the experience. But there is nothing in anybody's arsenal from a technological basis that has been shown even close to definitively of detecting anything psychic or paranormal, other than human beings. I mean, people can.
Okay. So what's this buzz around an EMF detector and biometric sensors? What are they?
Well, an EMF detector, and there's many types. EMF stands for electromagnetic field.
Right.
And there are electromagnetic fields around us in all sorts of ways. I mean, broadcast radio, FM, AM, that's EMF. You've got fields being given off by your electrical appliances, by your computer. There are low-level electromagnetic fields being given off by biological beings, by people, by animals, by other things. You can think of it as they're almost different frequencies, like the stations on an FM band are different frequencies, but are all part of the same FM band. So these things, light is electromagnetic field of sorts. So there's all this different stuff, and the technology was brought in because originally some work was done looking at how the Earth's magnetic field seems to connect to psychic experience of a broad sort. So the Earth itself gives off a field of a certain frequency, and that affects our brains, affects our minds, and during certain highs and lows of the field, we seem to have certain more types of experiences, like when the field is high on a local level, we might see more ghosts and have more psychokinetic experiences. When it's low, we might have more telepathic and clairvoyant experiences. And some of us, myself, Andy Nichols, and a couple other folks in the 80s, found these commercially available EMF detectors, which were the tri-field meter, which you often see on TV. And we started using them because we were looking to see if there were other fields besides the Earth field, and that one was the most available one. That senses technology around us, and there was an idea put out by Michael Persinger, who is one of the main researchers in the EMF area around the brain, that suggested that electromagnetic fields might affect us in other ways that could cause us to feel weird or see ghosts. So we started using these detection devices, and lo and behold, there was a connection, a correlation in these these place memory cases, where people see things over and over again, and even sometimes in ghost cases. But it's more like the phenomena may affect the EM environment, not that they're giving off EM fields or that they're doing something directly to the devices. So we still are too early in those. They don't detect ghosts, but they do detect electromagnetic pollution.
Why do you say that an understanding of ESP, extrasensory perception, and psychokinesis, mind over matter, is important in your field of work?
Well, let me ask you a question. This is this is something I like to throw out to people. Do ghosts have bodies, physical bodies?
Okay, do you want me to respond?
Yeah, I want you to respond. Yeah, respond to that.
Okay, I would say physical touching bodies. I would say no.
Okay, so here's the question. This is something I have to throw out to a lot of the ghost hunters, because on the one hand they'll say that psychokinesis doesn't exist, and the other they'll talk about a ghost moving an object. So how did that ghost move an object, a physical object, without a physical body? The answer to that is mind over matter. A ghost is actually only mind or spirit. Any effect that they do on the physical world around them at all is by definition mind over matter, therefore it is psychokinesis. So studying psychokinesis in the living, because it's a lot easier to get a living volunteer than a dead one, it helps us understand, perhaps, process otherwise.
Wow.
And the other side of it is, we talk about us seeing ghosts. What about ghosts seeing us? I mean, how do they navigate around the world without physical senses, without eyes and ears? How can they hear people? And the answer to that is through ESP. They are, again, only mind. they pick up perhaps our thoughts, but they pick up things clairvoyantly with the psychic senses, because that's all they really have, again, by definition. So when we look at any definition of ghosts, the idea that they can interact with the physical environment has to involve a different process than the way we interact with the physical environment normally. And ESP and PK happen to fit those.
Interesting. Okay, have you seen a ghost?
Seen, no. Felt, smelled, and heard, yes. And not everybody, the thing is that we put a real emphasis on seeing. I mean, let's face it, the phrase is seeing is believing, not hearing is believing or touching is believing. So there's that element of it, but not everybody processes the information, because the reality is that when you have a true, what we think is a true apparition case, you might have, let's say, 10 people in the room and 3 people might see the ghost. Well, that means the ghost is not visible to the naked eye, because everybody would see the ghost if that was the case. You could also photograph the ghost if that was the case. It is more of a connection. The ghost is making a connection somehow with your perception, the way we perceive things visually, not the way that we see things visually. And so some people process information visually, and some people do it with their sense of hearing, auditorily. Some people might feel things or even smell things, and sometimes combinations of those. So it's really about perception, not about senses in these cases.
So ghostly appearances, and as you pointed out at the beginning of the show, ghost is a broad term, but we use it anyway. Ghostly appearances are not universal, and they're not universal to the people, and then they're not physical. They're selective, and they're selective to only a few that seem to be in tune with their higher senses.
It may be an in-tuned process. It may be, for all we know, it could be that just for whatever reason you connect with that particular person who's died. It could be that you are psychically sensitive on one level. And part of the problem here, though, is there probably are a lot more people who are having these experiences that are pretty much ignoring or denying them, so we really don't have any idea of how many people might be sensitive to seeing or hearing ghosts. Because they tend to keep that pretty close to the vest. It's a tough thing when you're, even all the surveys, the polls show that people have, more than 50% of people say that they've had some sort of ghostly encounter, and closer to 70%, I believe, when in a recent poll show they believe in life after death or believe in ghosts. So the belief thing is there, but for some reason it's still social stigma to talk about these things. Certainly to talk about the fact that you've heard them rather than just seen them.
Loyd, have you done any research into dreams?
Yeah.
What's your finding on dreams? Because you'll have more visions. Well, we'll have more visions in your dreams. So,
right. Well, yeah.
You can see them.
Well, I actually wrote a book. I did a lot of research and wrote a book on psychic dreams back in the early 90s.
Really?
Yeah. It's called Psychic Dreaming. You can actually find used copies pretty easily out there. It's out of print. I'm hoping to bring it back to print in a year or two, but it's not that hard to find used copies of it. And the dream state's a really interesting one for psychic researchers because it is a time, a state of mind where our normal barriers are dropped, and literally anything can happen, and it's okay because it's a dream state. And when I was interviewing people about their dreams, specifically about psychic dreams of various types, which included, by the way, having encounters with deceased loved ones in their dreams, one of the things that was really interesting was an almost universal answer from people about how they knew that the dream, let's say of their grandfather who was deceased, or of something that was about to happen or was happening at the moment, how that dream, they could tell the difference between that dream and, let's just say, just something that was conjured up out of their psyche. And universally, everybody said it felt different. I don't know, they couldn't put it into words. They said it just felt different. And that's an interesting thing when you think about it, because that all of our experience is subjective. It's about feeling. It's about our individual perceptions. We don't see the world all the same way. And dream states are a perfect example of why we've probably a lot more than just the massive tissue we call brain. There's no explanation for what's going on in the dream state from any sort of mechanistic, materialistic perspective, at least at this point.
What's your take on mainstream science view of your work?
Well, there's the public take, which You have a lot of deniers who are incredibly vocal. One of my colleagues, Daryl Bem, recently published a precognition study in a mainstream psychology journal, and they raked that experiment over the coals before they'd even consider publishing it. Tore it apart, put it back together. They felt that there was nothing wrong with the experiment. They didn't necessarily agree with the conclusion, but they still had to publish it. And the outcry, the outpouring of insane commentary from people who identified themselves as mainstream scientists was akin to what people said about Galileo saying, what he said, and people talking about the world being round back in the Middle Ages. It just was. You read some of these comments, including scientists who say that I'm not even going to bother reading this because it can't possibly be true, which makes you think, well, what kind of scientist doesn't read research to really assess whether it's real? That's really not science. That's about the most unscientific thing you can get. I've talked to a lot of scientists, as have many of my colleagues, however, who individually will express interest, will even say that they've had experiences, but they're not about to say it in front of their colleagues. They're not about to say it in front of people they work for, and they're not about to say it in front of other people in their field, for the most part, because a lot of them believe, and unfortunately rightly so, that these deniers and people who are yelling the most can cost them their jobs. And people have lost their jobs and have been uninvited from conferences because they have expressed an interest in this subject. You only need to look back at the history of science and psychology specifically. William James, who's essentially the father of modern American psychology, you can find almost no reference in his biography by psychologists or people in mainstream psychology, or even just simply mainstream biographies about the guy, that he was one of the early members of the American Society for Psychical Research and one of the early presidents of that he had any interest in that subject.
It's okay to say we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
If you read a report as a scientist and say, I don't understand this, and I don't know what it means, but to simply not read a report,
right,
judge it before you've read the first sentence, there's a word for that. It's called ignorance.
Yeah, and prejudice.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think that if they read the report and said, I don't agree with the conclusions, I can't explain this, but I don't agree with the conclusions, that would be science, even if they walked away from it at that point. But to just basically dismiss these out of turn is it's crazy. It's crazy making for a lot of us.
Well, I would challenge mainstream science to answer for us why we'll just focus on human beings.
Yeah.
Why human beings all look differently, every single one of us. We act differently, we think differently, we have different desires, and we can't be controlled.
Right.
Okay? We can't.
There are just so many things that mainstream science cannot explain at this point in time. Even within ourselves, there's an element of understanding of how the sense of smell works that's still not understood. We don't understand how chlorophyll turns, through photosynthesis, turns sunlight into energy with the efficiency that it does. I mean, if we understood that, we would have 99% efficient solar cells.
Indeed.
We would not be dependent on the oil companies. There's a lot that science doesn't understand, and science is a process. It's not a dogmatic body of knowledge. That's even a lot of scientists don't seem to understand.
Well, on the one hand, thank the Lord we have science to get us out of the dogma of the past religion. So we have science, and the emergence of the two can make some sense of the universe. But then on the other hand, you want science to go beyond the final frontier and explore things that we don't know the answer for. And again, say, we've tried to figure this out and we can't. We'll need to come back to it. We don't have enough data.
Right.
There's no harm in not knowing, and they shouldn't hold back for fear of losing their jobs, and it comes right down to it. The dreaded word, Loyd, is money.
Yep.
It's fear of losing money that prompts these poor folks to hang back and from speaking perhaps what their hearts want to speak. Maybe not.
You're absolutely right, and that's the problem. I mean, there just simply aren't enough independently wealthy researchers out there, I think. It should never be wrong in science to ask questions. Perhaps it's less right to jump to conclusions. but we do that constantly, and we revise as more information comes in. This is part of the process of learning. It's part of the process of science. But, millions of people have these experiences every year, psychic experiences. And to just dismiss them as mass hysteria or hallucination without looking at the question, because the question to you is too disturbing since it involves the supernatural or borders on spirituality, it's not scientific. And it's also ignoring a huge element of who we are as human beings, that if we understood that, even if it wasn't psychic, even if we just simply spent the time looking at that question to try to figure out what it was rather than, assuming that, even considering it psychic, they're not even willing to do that. That's the biggest problem I've got with a lot of these folks, is that they're not even willing to do the research to find an alternative explanation.
Would you say that the world accepts the emotion of love?
I'd say yes.
Okay. Can you prove it on a measurable scale, please?
Of course not. Yeah,
exactly.
It's an important question. And I found years ago I read a study about human emotion and brain scans. They were looking to figure out what part of the brain where love and hate and anger were. And it struck me as really ridiculous that their subjects were method actors. And the rationale was that method actors could conjure up, a memory that would cause them to have that emotion, as opposed to bringing somebody in and saying, I want you to be angry right now, so we can find the part of your brain where anger is happening. That's a little hard for somebody to spontaneously do. But if you're basing the study of emotion in the brain on a small group of people who are not necessarily having the actual emotion, but just simply remembering what the emotion felt, that is a step removed from the actual emotion. So those studies are kind of spurious. They really can't tell you much.
Indeed. Well, we don't mean to beat up on the world of science here. We need science. We love it, and this show embraces it. But there is the great mystery of consciousness and the afterlife. And look, there's nobody bigger, more so than me, Loyd, that wants to jump in the Starship Enterprise and boldly belt off into the physical universe. But the final frontier for me is the study of consciousness and the afterlife and the purpose of universal existence. And I think that's the greatest challenge of all. And just because we don't have an absolute clue where to begin doesn't mean we need to sweep this thing away, because it's what life is all about.
Yeah,
is consciousness and afterlife. How do you explain, and I've brought this up on the show so many times, and the listeners will go, here we go again, but how do you explain when a psychic clairvoyant can tell you things about a deceased loved one that only you knew, and it was impossible for the reader to have that information? Right.
And we do have, just so you know, we do have an alternate explanation within parapsychology, of course, which I don't agree with necessarily, and that is the idea that the medium was using their telepathic ability to pick up the information from you and put that in the clothing of talking to the dead.
Well, great. That's another mystery. Wow.
Of course, it's solving one mystery with another. I've worked with mediums
I've heard that, I've heard that before,
Yeah. And in some cases that can be the case. In other cases it does not seem to be that. I have colleagues who I have debates with or discussions with who don't believe that what we would call conscious ghosts or apparitions are truly that. They think they're projections of living people. And I find, honestly, that the complexity of the argument and the way that that's created, they say that they believe, they've come from it, that the idea that consciousness can exist on its own after death is infinitely more complex than a living or persons in a group connecting together with the environment, creating essentially a complex, responsive something. To me, that's like, I tease one of my buddies and call it the holodeck theory. He'll be appreciative of that as a Star Trek fan. Where we're giving the environment and people the ability to come together and create the holodeck from the Enterprise. And that is somehow simpler than somebody's hanging around after they're dead as a conscious being. To me, that's a lot simpler. So it just really depends sometimes philosophically on how you're approaching things, too. I find it really interesting that in the polls of scientists, that the scientists who are most open to psychic ability and to this stuff are quantum physicists. and that the people who are least open are psychologists.
Loyd, throughout the years of your work, can you talk about a couple of extraordinary experiences you've discovered along the way?
Sure. Kind of a key experience I had when I was working in the core faculty back when John F. Kennedy University actually had a parapsychology program back in the 1980s. I did an investigation of a case where the family, this is a family outside of San Francisco in a town called Livermore, were all seeing the ghost, or it seemed to be the ghost of a woman who used to live in the house. The previous inhabitant of the house who did not die in the home, she died in a hospital of cancer, and not abruptly, so it kind of goes against those kind of folklore stories. The family members had all seen the woman multiple times since they moved in, but until about a year and a half into this, had never talked to each other about it. And what brought this on was their 12-year-old son, one of the folks who had seen the ghost, suddenly talking about some of the antique stuff. They bought the house in an estate sale, and it included a number of furniture items and some other collectibles that they had bought in that estate sale after the woman had died. And the boy started talking about some of the collectibles and where they came from, and his mother asked, how do you know this? Did you find paperwork, et cetera? And he said, well, Lois told me. And she said, well, who's Lois? And he said, the ghosts that you, Dad, and Grandma are seeing but aren't talking about. And from there, it went to him explaining that he actually saw the ghost and started talking to her when he first saw her, and that they actually had established kind of a friendship. And she was even, he said, helping him study for tests and such, helping him with his homework, to which the mother actually responded that his grades actually had gotten better since they moved into this house.
Wow.
When I was there, we were told that the ghost was with us, did not have a psychic with us. We actually worked with the boy. He became our medium, and he essentially translated, or he repeated what Lois, the ghost, said when I asked a whole bunch of questions. And I asked a lot of questions about why she didn't move on and what she was, because she could be seen wearing different clothing, for example, even at different ages. And she said that through the boy, that she could think of herself a certain way, and that's the image she projected. She even used the line, or at least the boy said she used the line, she's a ball of conscious energy like one of those aliens from Star Trek. She used to watch the original series, apparently.
Really?
So that was a really interesting way, and there was just no literature that this kid could have picked up that would have been easy for him to find at the time that was in print that would have given him hints of this stuff. So we also had a number of other kind of specific things happen, one of which was I had been asked, this is 1985, so it's only a little while after Ghostbusters was in the public consciousness, and I had been asked specifically by the boy. He said, Lois specifically said, I wanted to make sure that we were not bringing any of that stuff that they saw in Ghostbusters. The ghost traps and the
right.
particle accelerators. So apparently Lois didn't trust us, because at one point I said, does Lois have any questions for me and the folks that were with me? And there were 3 questions asked, one of me and one of each of the 2 other investigators, that related directly to not so much our lives, but to the conversation we had in my car driving from the university to Livermore.
Really?
Which they were very specific, and we had not talked about this from the moment we walked in the house, and I actually had recorded the conversation in the house, so I knew that we hadn't talked about it. And when I asked, how does Lois know to ask these questions, of course the other alternative is somehow my car was bugged, but there was no motive for this. So Chris looked over at the empty chair where Lois was supposedly sitting and turns back and says, well, she didn't trust you guys because of Ghostbusters, so she got in your car at the university and rode in the back of the car all the way down here to listen in on your conversation. And that, just those kinds of responses, the specifics of the conversation, the specifics. She also gave us information about her only living relative, who the mother had been trying to track down through various legal means and was blocked at every turn. It was correct information. I had been given family stories through Chris from Lois, and he verified the stories. He was 90-something years old in a rest home, but he verified the stories for us. In fact, he finished the stories as I started telling them to him, what Lois had said. So that was kind of a turning point experience for me.
Wow.
Another one, is a case that I've been involved in long term, which is a restaurant here in the California coast, the Moss Beach Distillery, just south of San Francisco, and the ghost there is known as the Blue Lady. We know her as Kate. And even from the first time I walked in there, the first investigation I did, which I had a medium from Japan with me, who had a conversation with her, and the ghost offered to do something for us, and we actually had the ghost opening the back door for us 6 times on camera.
Oh, gosh.
Which was kind of really cool. And every time I went back there, something would happen typically. I brought multiple psychics there. They all got the same information. They got, in fact, information that kind of fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, one of which was actually finally confirmed recently thanks to some new information that had been uploaded on the Internet. And had my own experiences with her as well, to where she's apparently appeared, according to witnesses, she's appeared with me at some events that I've gone to. People have actually seen her with me.
Wow. Did you catch the door opening and closing on film? Is it still available?
It's a Japanese show. I have like a videotape of the original show that was broadcast in Japan. They sent me a tape of that. It was never broadcast here in the States. This was a show that we actually did around the psychic medium for Japanese TV. But yeah, we caught that. I think they only showed 1 or 2 times, as I recall, on the tape, rather than all of them.
Okay, so what did the TV audience in Japan, what did the media in Japan make of it when they saw it?
They were very impressed. But the thing is that this was a series of shows about this very famous medium in Japan who had worked with police and had been doing a whole bunch of things. So to them, and the Japanese culture is very different here as well, this was just another amazing thing around Mrs. Gibo, the psychic.
Okay. Okay, to me it's quite stunning, but...
I agree. I mean, the craziest thing was the first time the door opened, the back door, we actually saw the push bar and the door was a back door kind of go in and the door swing open, and I had never worked with these Japanese, these production people before, and I didn't know whether or not I should trust them or not, so I sent one of my people outside to stay outside the entire time as the psychic asked her to do it again, and 5 more times with one of my folks sitting outside cracking up. She was laughing by the 5th time because the last time apparently it opened, as I recall, and I remember from her laughter, it kind of slowly opened as if it was like some really weird theatrical effect, and she just we think she just was doing that on purpose, the ghost. Bit
of sarcasm, bit of fun, huh?
Totally, yeah, totally.
Have you experienced any other psychokinesis activity?
Yeah, I worked. Well, I've experienced it in a lot of different ways. I've actually been involved in some of the spoon-bending parties that happened in the 80s, for example, and some of the analysis of that. I'm also a professional magician and mentalist, so I actually know how to fake this stuff and know a lot about that perspective. But I worked with a guy, the late Martin Caden. Martin Caden was a science and science fiction writer who was also a consultant to NASA, and he was able to move small objects even under extremely well-controlled conditions. And he and I actually did a couple workshops and taught people to move objects, and I've actually taught people since then. Marty was kind of a character of sorts. He's also the creator of the $6 Million Man TV show, among other things, based on one of his books. So really? He has a place in cultural history as well. But he definitely had the ability and the ability to kind of charge up other people. And I've seen other situations, both on cases and in other circumstances, where people have been able to move objects or do some PK of different sorts.
Well, I was on your website and I watched the video of your appearance on the View television show with Whoopi Goldberg and the gang. It was very interesting. I enjoyed that. When was that interview, your appearance on the show?
3 years ago, almost exactly. It was 2008.
Really? Okay. I was rather surprised and pleased to find out that for the movie Ghost with Demi Moore and the late Patrick Swayze, that the writer or the producer or someone researched your book, one of your books, prior to production. Can you talk a bit about that, please, Loyd?
Yeah, I only found this out after the fact. It's
okay.
Kind of funny. I was watching the movie and thinking, that seems awfully familiar. The movie was a great movie, but then I found out through someone who actually was the writer's assistant, the screenwriter who did that he pulled a good amount of the behavior of the ghost and kind of the rules of being a ghost from my first book, ESP, Hauntings, and Poltergeists, which came out in '86, and from a couple of books by the late D. Scott Rogo, who was one of my mentors and teachers. He died in 1990. But it was kind of very, very nice to hear that. And Whoopi was really nice about it. Whoopi is the one who told them. That's how I got on The View. She apparently told them that my book was used for that movie, and that's how they got to me, actually.
That's right. Whoopi was in that movie, wasn't she? Huh?
She won an Academy Award for that movie.
Yeah, that's right. And she was also in Star Trek: The Next Generation
too. That's correct, as Guinan. Yeah, but
yeah.
It was kind of fun meeting her because she actually thanked me for her Academy Award. It was very, very amusing.
And you didn't even know at the time what was going on.
Right. That's right.
That's great. That's great. Okay, so what's in the store for the future for you?
Well, besides the Ghosts, Hauntings, and Spirits book that's out from New Page, which is actually going to be hitting the stands, I believe, August 15th.
Okay.
I also have another book out with an actual psychic I work with by the name of Annette Martin, and this is called The Ghost Detective's Guide to Haunted San Francisco. And it's kind of come along with us on a few investigations of some major places in the Bay Area, San Francisco area, including Alcatraz and the Moss Beach Distillery, in fact. And we even have transcripts of my conversations with the psychic and her conversations with the ghosts, Annette's conversation with the ghosts. So that's out. I'm also working with Atlantic University. I'm on faculty there now and teaching an online course on parapsychology through Atlantic University. And we've got a major parapsychology conference coming up in October, which is open to the public. It's October 14th through 16th in Virginia Beach. And if folks go to atlanticuniv.edu, they'll see the Parapsychology and Consciousness Conference right there on the front page. And we have a lot of the top folks in the field who are speaking about all aspects of psychic phenomena who are going to be speaking at that conference. And the other thing is that I have another website besides mindreader.com, and that's hauntedbychocolate.com, because I'm also a chocolatier, and am involved in the world of chocolate. So I make chocolate, and once the weather starts cooling down, I'll be shipping again, and you'll see a lot more of my specialty chocolates on my website, including my Ghost Drops and the Cocoa Oracle Chocolate Fortune System.
Wow. I did read something about chocolate on you. So what's a chocolatier real quick, Loyd?
Chocolatier is somebody who makes chocolate typically by blending other people's chocolates. So we make like truffles and blend chocolates to make different chocolate bars and such. That's opposed to a chocolate maker who actually makes chocolate from the cacao bean, so from bean to the bar. So I blend other people's chocolates. So a couple of chocolates from Guittard and Callebaut. They're Belgian and American chocolates. And I produce dark chocolate and milk chocolate and truffles and things like that.
All right. Well, chocolate's one of the best things humanity's ever produced, at least in the top 100, put it that way.
Well, yeah, and, it's the most craved substance on the planet Earth.
Really?
Yes, it is. All the surveys have shown that, yeah.
Okay. We have been discussing the new book, Ghosts, Spirits, and Hauntings. Am I Being Haunted? With Loyd Auerbach. Loyd, thanks very much for coming onto the show and talking about the book and your work. Good stuff.
Thank you, Sandy.
Have a good night. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Please visit Loyd Auerbach's website, mindreader.com. Thank you for listening to the Universal Learning Series radio show, where we discover the spiritual and scientific universe.